Welcome back. Tonight's next part of Fiddler on the Roof carries us into Chapter 5, a wedding day of bright vows, bold steps, and a boundary that won't bend. I'll read at an easy, sleep-safe pace as joy and ache share the same table, and the village learns how far a dance can go. Chapter 5, The Dance of Dissolution and Union. The morning of Zeitel's wedding dawned with that peculiar quality of light that seems to exist solely for momentous occasions, as though the universe itself had conspired to provide appropriate illumination for the transformation of one state of being into another. The alchemy by which two separate souls would attempt, through ritual and intention, to become something simultaneously more and less than the sum of their individual parts. I stood in our courtyard, having risen even earlier than my usual custom, watching the sky perform its daily metamorphosis, from the deep indigo of night through the various gradations of dawn, pearl, rose, gold, each shade seeming to promise something different about the day that was to come. The house behind me was already astir with that particular energy that precedes celebrations. A vibration in the very air that suggested normal life had been temporarily suspended in favor of something both more elaborate and more essential. I could hear Golda's voice, raised not in anger, but in that tone of controlled urgency that she employed when orchestrating complex domestic campaigns, directing our daughters and the neighbor women who had come to help in the preparations, like a conductor managing a particularly challenging symphony. "The chickens," she was saying. "Who is watching the chickens? They must be slaughtered according to proper ritual. And where is Nahum the butcher? He promised to be here before dawn." The chickens in question, 3 of them, which represented a significant portion of our livestock wealth, were confined in a temporary pen, their agitation suggesting they possessed some avian presentiment of their impending sacrifice. I watched them for a moment, these humble birds who would give their lives so that we might celebrate life's continuance, and found myself thinking about the strange mathematics of joy and sacrifice, how every celebration was built upon a foundation of loss, every union predicated on the dissolution of what had come before. "Papa?" The voice belonged to Zeitel, my eldest daughter, my first baby, who stood now in the doorway dressed in her wedding garments. Not yet complete, for tradition dictated certain elements could only be added at specific moments in the ceremony, but already transformed from the girl I had known into something else, something liminal, caught between daughter and wife, between past and future, between the family that had made her and the family she would make. "You're beautiful," I said, the words emerging with a simplicity that surprised me, given my usual tendency toward elaborate articulation. But perhaps there were moments when simplicity was the only appropriate response to profundity. She crossed to me, moving carefully in her unaccustomed finery. The dress that Model had sewn with his own hands, working late into the night for weeks, each stitch an act of devotion, each seam a promise of dedication. The morning light caught the fabric in such a way that it seemed to glow with its own internal radiance, or perhaps that was merely the projection of a father's eyes, unable to distinguish between the actual and the ideal when regarding his offspring. "Are you happy, Papa?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested this was not merely a request for reassurance, but a genuine question about the complex emotional territory we were navigating. "Happy?" I considered the word, rolling it around in my mind like a sommelier testing wine. "I'm many things, my daughter. I'm proud of you, of your courage to choose love over comfort. I'm terrified of the life that awaits you, of the struggles you'll face, of my inability to protect you from them. I'm grateful that you found someone who sees you as you are and loves you not despite but because of it. And yes, somewhere in that mixture of pride and terror and gratitude, there is happiness, though it's a more complex happiness than I had anticipated. She took my hand, her fingers still the fingers I remembered from when she was small, when she would reach for me with absolute trust that I would be there, that I could solve any problem, heal any hurt. Model is a good man, she said. He is, I agreed, poor as a synagogue mouse, nervous as a cat in a doghouse, but good, and perhaps goodness is rarer than gold, more valuable than security. Perhaps, she asked, smiling. Definitely, I corrected, though I reserve the right to reconsider when the rent is due and the cupboard is bare. We stood together in companionable silence, watching the village wake around us. Other families were preparing for the celebration, for in our community, a wedding was not merely a private affair, but a communal event, a reaffirmation of our collective existence, our shared traditions, our mutual support in the face of a world that often seemed hostile to our very existence. I could see neighbors emerging from their houses, dressed in their finest clothes, which, for most of us, meant clothes that were merely clean and mended, rather than actually fine, carrying dishes to contribute to the feast, their faces bearing that particular expression of determined celebration that characterized our people's approach to joy. We would be happy, by God, despite everything that conspired against our happiness. Papa, Zeidel said suddenly, there's something I need to tell you. My heart performed its familiar acrobatic maneuver, that leap and plummet that accompanied any unexpected revelation from my daughters. On your wedding day? Can't it wait until after you've safely married and I've had sufficient alcohol to cushion whatever blow you're about to deliver? It's about Chava, she said, and her voice dropped to a whisper. She's been meeting him. The scholar's son, Fyedka. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, though I maintained my physical equilibrium through sheer force of will. Meeting him? What do you mean, meeting him? By the old oak tree, past the cemetery. They read together. Talk. She thinks no one knows, but I followed her yesterday. Zeidel's face bore an expression of conflicted loyalty to her sister, to me, to the traditions that bound us all. Papa, she's falling in love with him. Love, I repeated, the word tasting like ashes in my mouth, with a boy who might be a scholar, might be handsome, might be everything admirable, but who is not, cannot be, will never be, one of us. He's Jewish, Zeidel pointed out. There are different kinds of Jewish, I said, though even as I spoke I recognized the weakness of my argument. He's modern, secular. He reads Greek and Latin, for heaven's sake. What kind of Jew reads Greek and Latin? An educated one, Zeidel suggested gently. Before I could respond to this uncomfortable logic, Golda's voice rose above the general din of preparation. Zeidel, where is the bride? We need to fix her hair. The guests are beginning to arrive. Zeidel squeezed my hand once more, then hurried inside, leaving me alone with this new knowledge that sat in my stomach like a stone. Chava, my quiet one, my reader, my dreamer, meeting secretly with Fyedka, reading together, and what else? What passages were they sharing? What ideas were they exchanging? What boundaries were they crossing in those stolen moments by the oak tree? I was interrupted in my spiral of parental anxiety by the arrival of Laser Wolf, dressed in his finest clothes, his prosperity evident in every line of his outfit. He approached me with a dignity that I had to admire, given that I had rejected him for my daughter in favor of a penniless tailor based on a fictional dream. "Tevye," he said, nodding formally. "Laser," I replied, matching his formality. We stood in awkward silence for a moment, two men navigating the complex terrain of disrupted expectations and salvaged pride. Finally, he spoke. "I've brought a gift for the couple," he said, producing a wrapped package. "The finest cuts, for their first Sabbath as husband and wife." The generosity of the gesture, from a man who had every right to bitterness, moved me more than I could express. That's very kind, Laser. "We're a small community," he said simply. "We must support each other, even when—" He paused, then continued, "Even when things don't go as we might have hoped." He walked away before I could respond, his dignity intact, and I found myself thinking about the various forms of nobility, how it could manifest in rejection as much as in acceptance, in grace under disappointment as much as in triumph. The morning progressed with the inexorable momentum of ritual, each moment prescribed by centuries of tradition, each gesture weighted with the accumulated meaning of countless generations who had performed these same acts, spoken these same words, felt perhaps these same complex emotions. The musicians arrived, a ragtag collection of instrumentalists whose combined talents were somewhat greater than the sum of their individual limitations, and began the traditional melodies that would accompany the day's events. In the house, I knew, Zeidel was being prepared by the women, dressed and adorned according to customs that predated memory, each ornament and arrangement designed to transform her from individual to symbol, from Zeidel to bride, from the particular to the universal. Meanwhile, somewhere in the village, Mottel was undergoing his own transformation, surrounded by the men who would escort him to claim his bride. Their voices raised in songs that celebrated and mourned simultaneously the passage from one state to another. I found myself swept into the preparations, my protests that I needed time to prepare myself emotionally dismissed by Golda with the ruthless efficiency of a general who cannot afford to indulge the philosophical hesitations of his troops. There were tables to arrange, guests to greet, 1,000 small details that collectively constituted the difference between a wedding and chaos. It was while carrying chairs from various neighbors' houses, for we had neither sufficient furniture nor space to accommodate all our guests, that I encountered Perchik and Hodel in what they clearly believed was a private moment. They stood behind the synagogue, their hands not quite touching but the space between them charged with such electricity that I could practically see the sparks. "In the city," Perchik was saying, his voice carrying over to where I stood, "men and women dance together. It's considered normal, natural even." "Normal," Hodel repeated, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was testing the word, examining its implications. "And what else is normal in the city?" "Choice," Perchik replied with the fervor that characterized all his pronouncements. "The freedom to choose one's own path, one's own partner, one's own destiny. Not like here, where even at a wedding we maintain divisions." "And if one chooses wrongly?" Hodel asked. then at least the mistake is one's own, not imposed by others. I cleared my throat loudly, causing them to spring apart like opposing magnets suddenly activated. "The chairs," I said, hefting the ones I carried with exaggerated effort, "won't move themselves. And Perchik, I believe the men are gathering at Mordecai's house. You wouldn't want to miss the groom's procession." He had the grace to blush, but his eyes remained fixed on Hodel for a moment longer before he departed, and in that look I saw a future I wasn't ready to contemplate. My daughter following this revolutionary to God knows where, abandoning not just her family, but her entire world for the promise of something new, something different, something that might be better or might be disaster, but would definitely be change. "Papa," Hodel began, but I raised my hand. "Not today," I said. "Today we have one wedding to manage. Tomorrow will be sufficient for whatever announcements or revelations you're preparing." She nodded, but there was something in her expression that suggested tomorrow might not wait for our convenience, that the future had a way of arriving whether we were prepared or not. The wedding ceremony itself began in the early afternoon, when the sun had reached that position in the sky that provided light without glare, warmth without oppression. The entire village had gathered, our Jewish community, of course, but also, somewhat surprisingly, several of our Christian neighbors, including Fyodor the constable and his son, Sasha. Their presence a reminder that, despite the tensions and divisions that characterized our broader existence, at the local level, human connections sometimes transcended official animosities. Model stood under the Chava, a canopy that Golda and the other women had constructed from our best tablecloth and 4 poles that had been decorated with such flowers as the season provided. His thin frame trembling with an emotion that seemed too large for his body to contain. His face, usually marked by anxiety, had acquired a transcendent quality, as though he had glimpsed something beyond the material world and found it good. Then came the moment when Seidel appeared, escorted by Golda and me, her face veiled according to custom, but her presence unmistakable. The crowd fell silent, that particular hush that descends when the ordinary world briefly acknowledges the sacred. Even the children, usually irrepressible in their energy, seemed to understand that something significant was occurring. As we walked her toward her waiting groom, I found myself thinking about time, about how it could simultaneously race and crawl, how this walk seemed both endless and instantaneous, how I was simultaneously in this moment and in all the moments that had led to it, holding my infant daughter for the first time, teaching her to walk, watching her learn to read, seeing her discover love, all of it compressed into these few steps that would deliver her from one life to another. The rabbi, ancient and trembling himself, though with age rather than emotion, began the traditional words, his voice carrying the authority of centuries, even as it quavered with his own mortality. The blessings were spoken, the wine was shared, the rings exchanged, simple bands that Model had somehow managed to purchase, though I suspected he would be paying for them in installments for the next year. It was during the 7 blessings, when the community's attention was entirely focused on the couple, that I noticed Chava standing at the edge of the crowd, and beside her, though carefully maintaining a respectable distance, stood Fyedka. They were not looking at each other. Indeed, they seemed to be making a pointed effort not to look at each other. But there was something in their parallel postures, in the way they held themselves, that suggested an awareness of each other that transcended mere physical proximity. My attention was drawn back to the ceremony by the sound of breaking glass, Mottle stamping on the wine glass wrapped in cloth, that moment of destruction that reminded us, even in our joy, of the temple's destruction, of the fragility of happiness, of the fact that everything that is built can be broken. The crowd erupted in celebration, voices raised in the traditional Mazel Tov that seemed to shake the very heavens with its intensity. And then the feast began, though to call it a feast, perhaps, overstates what our combined resources could provide. Yet what we lacked in luxury, we compensated for in enthusiasm, in the determination to celebrate despite, or perhaps because of, the poverty that constrained us. The musicians played with more energy than skill, but the music served its purpose, providing the rhythm for our joy, the soundtrack for our temporary transcendence of daily struggle. It was during the meal, such as it was, that Perchik stood and did something that would be discussed in Anatevka for years to come. He raised his glass and said, "In honor of the bride and groom, I would like to propose something radical." The word radical caused a visible ripple of concern through the assembled company. Radical was not a word that boded well in our traditional context. "I propose," he continued, seemingly oblivious to or perhaps energized by the tension he had created, "that we dance. Not just the men with the men and the women with the women, as tradition dictates, but together, men and women, as partners." The silence that followed this proposition was so complete that we could hear the wind in the trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the cosmic grinding of tradition being challenged. It was the rabbi who spoke first, his ancient voice carrying surprising strength. "This is not our way," he said simply. "Perhaps," Perchik replied, and I had to admire his courage even as I deplored his timing. "It's time for our ways to expand, to include joy that isn't segregated, celebration that isn't divided." "And where in Torah," the rabbi asked with the patience of someone who has had this argument before in different forms, "does it say men and women should dance together? Where does it say they shouldn't?" Perchik countered, which was technically accurate, but theologically problematic. The argument might have continued indefinitely, but it was Tevye who surprised everyone, including himself, by standing and extending his hand to Golda. "It's my daughter's wedding," I heard myself say, though I couldn't quite believe the words were emerging from my mouth. If there's a time to bend tradition without breaking it, perhaps this is it. As the words left my mouth, I felt the ground, which had felt so unsteady these past weeks, suddenly vanish beneath my feet. I stood between the ancient stone of the rabbi's disapproval and the shifting earth of my daughter's future. In that moment, I understood the fiddler as I never had before. His secret was not in standing still, for to stand still on a tilted roof is to surely fall. The secret of his balance, and of ours, was in the movement itself, in the terrifying, necessary, next step of the dance. Golda looked at me as though I had suddenly begun speaking in tongues, but after a moment's hesitation, she took my hand, and we danced, awkwardly, uncertainly, but we danced, and seeing us, others followed. Mottle and Seitel, of course, their faces radiant with a joy that transcended the controversy. Then Perchik and Huddle, moving together with a grace that suggested this was not their first dance, whatever they might claim. But it was when I saw Chava and Fyedka moving toward each other, their hands about to touch, that the spell broke. "No!" The word word tore from my throat with such force that the music stopped, the dancers froze, the entire celebration suspended in a moment of terrible clarity. "Not that," I said, my voice lower but no less firm. Some boundaries must remain." Chava's face transformed in an instant from joy to something else. Hurt, anger, disappointment, all compressed into an expression that would haunt me for days to come. She turned and fled, not running but moving with a dignity that was somehow worse than tears. Fyedka stood for a moment, his hand still extended toward the space where she had been, then slowly lowered it and walked away in the opposite direction. The celebration resumed, but the magic had been broken. We finished the rituals, went through the motions, but there was a subdued quality to the remainder of the evening, as though we had all been reminded that even in our moments of greatest joy, the divisions that defined us remained intact. Later, much later, after the guests had departed and the newlyweds had been escorted to their new home, a room above the tailor shop that Model had prepared, with touching attention to detail, I sat alone in our courtyard, the debris of celebration around me like the aftermath of a battle. Golda had gone to bed, exhausted by the day's efforts, and the house was quiet, except for the settling sounds that all houses make when adjusting to the absence of one of their inhabitants. "Lord," I said to the darkness, "I'm trying to understand your plan here. I've accepted the boy you sent for Seidel, even though he has nothing. I'm trying to accept the revolutionary you've sent for Hodel, though he'll probably take her away from us. But Chava and that boy, that's a bridge too far. Some things cannot be, should not be, must not be. You understand that, don't you?" The only answer was the sound of the fiddler on the roof, playing a melody that seemed to contain within it both the joy of the day and the sorrow of its ending, the celebration of union and the pain of separation, the hope of continuity and the fear of change. His music drifted across the village like a blessing or a curse, or perhaps simply an acknowledgement that life was complicated, that tradition and change were locked in an eternal dance, that every wedding contained within it the seeds of future loss, every celebration the shadow of future sorrow. I thought about my daughters, Seidel now a wife, beginning her own story, Hodel on the verge of choosing a path I couldn't follow, Chava nursing a wound I had inflicted but couldn't heal, Sprintsu and Bielku still young, but watching, learning, preparing for their own futures. Each of them a separate story that I could influence but not control, each of them dancing to their own music even as they remained part of the larger choreography of family, community, tradition. The moon rose, full and bright, casting shadows that seemed to dance even in stillness. Somewhere in the village, Seidel and Model were beginning their life together, their poverty cushioned by love, their future uncertain, but their present complete. Somewhere else, Hodel and Perchik were perhaps planning their own revolution, personal and political, simultaneously. And somewhere, Chava was reading by candlelight, escaping into worlds where the boundaries that constrained her didn't exist, where love could cross any divide, where tradition was something to be honored but not obeyed blindly. As for me, I sat in the darkness, a father who had managed one wedding but suspected the hardest challenges were still to come. The fiddler played on, his melody now so faint I might have been imagining it, but whether real or imagined, it provided the soundtrack to my thoughts, my fears, my hopes. We had survived this day, navigated its challenges, celebrated its joys, endured its sorrows. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new choices, new opportunities to fail or succeed in the impossible task of maintaining balance in an unbalanced world. "Thank you," I said finally to the darkness, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was thankful for. "Thank you for this day, for its complications and its blessings, for the love you've given my daughter, even if it comes with poverty attached, for the community that supports us, even when we challenge their expectations, for the strength to say no when necessary, even when it breaks my heart. And if you could see your way clear to making tomorrow slightly less complicated than today, I wouldn't complain, though I suspect you have other plans." I stood, my joints protesting the length of time I had been sitting, and made my way inside. The house felt different with Zeitel gone, as though the space she had occupied had left a visible absence, a gap in the family structure that would eventually heal but would always remain, like a scar that reminds us of wounds survived. In their bed, the younger girls slept, Sprinzu and Bielku, curled together like kittens, their faces peaceful in sleep, unaware of the complexities that awaited them. I paused at Chava's door, seeing the light still glowing beneath it. I raised my hand to knock, to try to explain, to bridge the gap I had created. But what could I say? That some traditions were too fundamental to challenge, that some boundaries were necessary for our survival, that loving someone from outside our faith was not just a personal choice, but a betrayal of centuries of ancestors who had died rather than abandoned their identity. All true, perhaps, but truth was cold comfort to a young heart that wanted what it wanted without regard for history or theology, or the complex negotiations between survival and assimilation. I lowered my hand and continued to my own room, where Golda slept with the exhaustion of a general after a successful but costly campaign. As I prepared for bed, moving quietly so as not to wake her, I thought about the dance, that moment when we had all stepped outside tradition, when men and women had moved together in celebration of love. It had felt both wrong and right simultaneously, dangerous and necessary, a violation and a validation. Perhaps that was what change always felt like. Not a clean break, but a messy negotiation. Not a revolution, but an evolution, painful and necessary and irreversible once begun. I lay down beside my wife, this woman who had been a stranger once, but was now as essential to my existence as breath itself. In her sleep, she moved closer to me, seeking warmth or comfort, or simply the familiar presence that had shared her bed for 25 years. I put my arm around her, carefully, gently, and she sighed in her sleep, a sound of contentment that suggested that despite all the challenges and changes, some things remained constant, some connections endured. Outside, distantly, I could still hear music, not the fiddler now, but voices raised in song, probably the younger men who were continuing the celebration in their own fashion, with stronger drink and less supervision. Their songs were bawdy and sacred simultaneously, celebrating the physical and spiritual aspects of union with equal enthusiasm, reminding us all that we were neither angels nor animals, but something in between, something complicated and contradictory and magnificently imperfect. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring its own challenges. The refugees from Zhytomyr would need continued assistance. My milk rounds would resume. Hodel would continue her studies with Perchik, moving closer to whatever future they were constructing together. Chava would. I didn't know what Chava would do, but I suspected it would challenge me in ways I wasn't prepared for. And somewhere, in a room above a tailor shop, Seidel and Mottl would wake to their first full day as husband and wife, facing all the mundane and magnificent realities that such a union entailed. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, in this moment suspended between celebration and sorrow, between tradition and change, between what was and what would be, I could rest. The wedding was accomplished. The first of my daughters had been successfully launched into her own story. The fiddler on the roof, whether real or metaphorical, had maintained his balance for another day. And we, all of us in Anatevka, had proven once again that we could bend without breaking, that we could dance on the edge of change without falling into chaos, that we could maintain our essential identity even as the world around us transformed with terrifying speed. "Thank you," I whispered one more time into the darkness, a final prayer before sleep. "Thank you for the dance, even if it led to difficulty. Thank you for the joy, even if it was tinged with sorrow. Thank you for the love that complicates everything and makes everything worthwhile. And if you're listening, which I suspect you always are, even when you pretend otherwise, please help me find the wisdom to know when to hold tight to tradition and when to let it evolve, when to say yes and when to say no, when to dance and when to stand still, because I suspect the music is just beginning, and I'm not sure I know all the steps." Sleep came at last, bringing with it dreams of dancers and fiddlers, of weddings and wanderings, of daughters growing wings, and fathers learning to let them fly. And through it all, the music continued, that eternal melody that accompanied our lives, sometimes joyful, sometimes sorrowful, always continuing, always calling us to maintain our balance, to keep our faith, to dance our dance on the roof of existence, precarious and beautiful, traditional and revolutionary, ending and beginning with each note, each step, each breath of our complicated, contradictory, absolutely necessary lives. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight. I hope I helped you unwind and drift a little closer to sleep. If you're enjoying these readings, there's a whole library of full books and cozy chapters waiting for you over on my Patreon. If you are already a member, then I thank you. It includes exclusive content, bonus episodes, and early access to new releases. You can also become a YouTube member if you haven't already, to listen ad-free and explore hundreds of other relaxing readings anytime you like. I'd love to have you there. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next one.